Part of this restoration on the CT175 is getting this down to where the frame is just bare. So obviously I have to remove the wheels and I have to remove the shocks. I started with the back wheel. First thing I needed to do was get rid of this chain. This chain was rusted in place to the point where I couldn't remove the master link. So I had to put a cutoff wheel on an angle grinder and cut that to remove it. The next thing I did was remove the axle nut and the lock washer. That was pretty simple. The work began after that. If you look at this side, this is the drive side, and you can see the rear sprocket, and this bracket right here is actually the tensioner. The chain tensioners are identical on both sides, but they are built just a little bit different. This outside edge is a little thicker than this inside edge, and there's a tick mark right here. Now there's also a tick mark on this side, which means when you pull these off, you don't have to remember which one is on the right side and which one is on the left. The only thing that you have to remember is when you're assembling all of this, that the chain tensioners go around the frame here, and that the thicker portion here with the tick mark is on the outside. Those tick marks are reference marks because on here on the frame, when you're adjusting the chain tension, you'll want to make sure that this axle is 90 degrees to the frame, and you want to make sure that it's even. So you'll look at these tick marks here and on the other side and make sure that the tick marks on the tensioner lines up. So when I got started with this, I managed to get the axle nut off pretty easily. The idea is that this axle nut is solid and it goes completely through the hub and through the other side. On this side there's a spacer right here, and there's also another spacer on the other side, and that's to make sure that this tire is centered inside of the swing arm. This is a view of the axle and the hub from the back of the bike. Again, here's the axle here itself. This is where the axle nut was. This is the chain tensioner here. There's a spacer on this side, and then you've got the wheel and the hub assembly. On the other side here, this is still the axle here. This is solid. Here's the chain tensioner on this side, and then another spacer. With this particular bike, you have the brake assembly, which actually sits at about that position right there and is held in place by a bracket down here. This axle gave me quite a run for my money. One of the problems that I had right in the beginning was that spacer right there was rusted to the axle itself. So I used a lot of penetrating oil, and the whole idea, again, I think I've mentioned this before, is just be patient. One of the things that you don't want to do when you're trying to drive this axle out of that hub is bugger up the thread. If we go back to this side, at the point where I was ready to start driving that axle back through, the first thing you can try is to use a wood mallet, a rubber mallet, or if you have a mallet with a plastic end. I didn't have one of those, and the axle wasn't going to go without a fight. So one of the tricks that I use is a block of wood with a hammer, and then just strike that wood against that axle and try and drive that axle out through that hub. I got a little bit of momentum going with that, but that wasn't going to do it for me. The problem that I had was I wasn't able to get any of the penetrating oil down inside of this axle and this spacer over here on this side. So I had to resort to a old trick that I learned years and years ago from my dad, and that is use some heat. So I got a flame going, and I just held that flame right there on that spacer. Fortunately, I was able to actually turn the axle and the spacer so that I could try and heat up the entire circumference of that spacer. And as I would do this, towards the end, I could actually hear some of that rust breaking free. The idea behind heating that is you're expanding metals of different densities, and they expand and contract differently, and you're just trying to break that rust. So that worked. After a while, I still wasn't able to drive the axle through using the wooden block and the hammer. If you look at my wooden block, you can see indentations from that axle. This is actually block number 2. The first one disintegrated on me in the process. So what I did, and this is something that if you have to go a little bit caveman on these, you're going to want to do, I took the axle nut and I threaded it back onto the axle. But I didn't thread it far enough to where the axle was actually protruding on the outside surface of this nut. Now what I had was a surface that I could directly hit that would drive that force and push that axle through there. If I bugger up the nut, that's an easy replacement. If I hit the end of the axle with a hammer and I bugger up the threads of that, that's not an easy replacement. So that's one trick that you can use. I would say it took me about 45 minutes to an hour just to get this axle so that it broke free of that spacer. But now I can take this axle off and get an idea of what's going on with it. I'm hoping that all it needs is a good cleaning job. One thing I want to mention real quick, going back to that heat, is obviously you're dealing with fire. You don't want to use fire anywhere that there might be a rubber seal or something that's really close that's going to get damaged, unless of course you have no other option. And of course you don't want to have a bunch of flammable material or flammable liquids in the area, because the last thing you want to do is set your garage on fire while you're trying to restore one of these old motorcycles. Anyways, I hope that was helpful. My next step is to pull this wheel and take a look at the brakes. Here is the rear axle, and it looks pretty bad initially. I'm going to hit this with the wire wheel and clean it up, and I hope that everything cleans up good enough that I don't have to worry about getting a new axle. You can see there, part of that video I was having trouble knocking that axle out, and it was dragging this chain tensioner along for the ride, and it ended up spreading it out. No big deal. This is soft enough metal that I was able to squeeze it back together. But on the inside of that, I don't know if you can see that little piece of metal, and I think that had kind of got caught up on the axle as it was being pushed out. So I'm going to clean that up a little bit before I put all of this stuff back together. It turns out that the two spacers on this wheel are identical. This is the one that was on the drive side where the sprocket was. You can see that line here. This is where it goes into the seal, and then this one actually just acts like a spacer. Now I'm going to keep these separate when I put this back together, because this one here has got some tool marks on it, and because this is going to be riding against a rubber oil seal, or to keep the dirt out and the water out of your hub, I don't want this piece rubbing in there with these tool marks. It could prematurely wear out that seal. So I'll keep these separate. They'll go back in the way that I pulled them out.